Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Morrill, and my family and I have been coming to Penny for nearly 17 years. Today I'm going to read John chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. On the third day, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Dear woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My time has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water," so they filled them to the brim. When he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet," they did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." This is the first of his miraculous signs. Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples. There they stayed for a few days. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning. We come this morning to John chapter 2, and our text is the familiar and famous story of Jesus turning water into wine. It's a story that you may be familiar with, but that you may not have thought much about until you just heard Melissa reading it, at which point you may have all kinds of questions or reactions. This is a story John is telling us of Jesus using his miraculous power to make wine for a party in which people have already been celebrating for some time. Why would he do that? If Jesus has this miraculous power, why use it on this? John even tells us that this is his first miracle. Why spend your miracle-working power here? And why introduce yourself with this kind of miracle? It raises all kinds of questions. For others, it makes them like Jesus even a little bit more. As one writer said, Jesus is the life of the party. Here's a party that's about to screech to a halt with great embarrassment for everybody and a sudden end to all the fun and celebration that everyone's having. And instead, here's Jesus making the party continue, saving the day. Instead of scowling at the side at everybody having fun, glaring at them about why they're having so much fun and doing all of these things. Instead, here's Jesus, the life of the party, saving the day and keeping the party going. Whatever we might say, or whatever our initial reaction might be to this story, it certainly demonstrates how interesting the character of Jesus is, and how he does not fit neatly into so many of the boxes in which we want to put him. But as to the meaning of the sign, or of the miracle itself, John is very clear as to what that is. He's not holding us in suspense. In verse 11, John tells us what this all meant. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. John tells us right there what this is all about. Jesus is revealing his glory at Cana of Galilee, and his disciples, seeing this glory, are putting their faith in him. This is the purpose for which John writes all the stories that he writes in his book. At the end of the book, a Gospel of John, chapter 20, John writes that there are so many stories to tell of Jesus. It's hard to choose which one to tell. But he chose the ones he did for a specific purpose. These are written, chapter 20, verse 31, these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. This is why John writes this, so that you may see the glory of Christ as the Messiah and the Son of God, and so that you may believe in him. And so each story contributes something to showing us the glory of Christ in order that we might trust him. Well, what does this story tell us then? What does this miracle tell us about the glory of Jesus? I want to suggest it shows us a couple of things. That he is the Lord of new creation joy and new covenant love. New creation joy and new covenant love. I want us to see these two things, and my hope is that through that, then we will also see what it means, what hope there is as we put our faith in him. So, Jesus is the Lord of new creation joy and new covenant love. Let's start with new creation joy. This all takes place in a joyous occasion, of course, as I've already mentioned, a wedding. It seems to be a family wedding. Mary maybe was connected in some way to the family. Maybe they're family members of hers. She seems to be very connected to what's going on, even have an inside track on the fact that wine is running out, and very concerned that this might spoil the party. So maybe it's a family wedding that they are at. Mary is there. Jesus is there as Mary's son, and even Jesus' disciples are there. And so family and friends are all gathered together. It's a time of joy and celebration, and also a time of great feasting. Wine and food is provided. Now, in the ancient world, the groom was financially responsible for providing, the groom's family was financially responsible for providing a great feast. And there was a whole system of social reciprocity, so that whoever was getting married had to throw a big feast that people would be invited to. Most of the community would be invited to. And it was your responsibility, because if you went to everyone else's feasts, when you were invited and you ate and drank there, then when it was your turn, when you got married, you had to throw a big feast that everyone could come to and have as much as they wanted to have a great wedding celebratory feast. In fact, this was no small deal. The feast went on for 7 days, usually. And there's some indication, some historical record, that you could be held legally liable if you didn't throw the full feast that was expected. Because again, social reciprocity. If you were eating everywhere else and then you didn't throw the kind of feast that left everyone well fed and full of joy, then you could be taken and held accountable in the community, financially accountable. So, and even if you didn't do that, you would be socially ashamed for the rest of your life if you failed at throwing one of these. I mean, think of a small community where you know everybody and nobody leaves. And so if you are publicly humiliated, you are publicly humiliated for life. Nobody forgets, right? So this is the setting. It's this wedding. Family and friends are there. The whole community is there. And the groom, perhaps because he was poor, perhaps because he tried to cut it close on the expenses, has now run out of wine before the party is over, and he's about to be greatly embarrassed. This is why it's actually rather high stakes when Mary comes to Jesus. She's very concerned about him, and for good reason. And so it's at this point that Jesus steps in, of course, and saves the day. He takes water and he makes wine miraculously. But we should note, even before looking at this particular act, making wine out of water, we should look at what John says about what this means. Now, John says this: what Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. In other words, the act itself of taking water and making it wine is a sign. A sign. That's John's favorite word for all of the miracles that Jesus does. He describes them over and over again as signs. Signs. This demonstrates the meaning of the miracles themselves. They weren't party tricks. They weren't random demonstrations to show off. In fact, this particular miracle, nobody seems to know that Jesus did it. When the master of ceremonies tastes the wine, he comes to the bridegroom, and he says to him, "Whoa, look what you've done. You've got good wine." Nobody even gives the credit to Jesus, who seems to have done it all behind the scenes. This isn't showing off. This isn't a party trick. This is a sign. And a sign is an act that points to a greater reality. So think of it this way. You're driving to Augusta and you're coming up I-95, and you see the sign that says 20 miles to Augusta, 20 miles. Or maybe you're coming south from up in the county or something, and you see the sign, 20 miles to Augusta. Now, the sign is a real thing. It's really there. You can see it. You could get out and knock on it. It's a real tangible thing. And it evokes real feelings. When we're driving on a long road trip and we see that sign that says 20 miles to Augusta, and I'm driving, it's been a long day, maybe a long night, I see that sign and it begins to evoke in me feelings of, a picture of home and climbing into bed and stretching out after a long day of driving. This sign really symbolizes something real ahead. And indeed, that's what it's pointing to, a real destination. Augusta is real. My home is real. My bed, thank God, is real. But all of these things, these real feelings that are connected to this real place that the real sign is pointing to, though the real sign is pointing to these real things, the sign is not the thing itself. It would be a great mistake, an unthinkable mistake, to mistake the sign for the thing itself. To pull up to the sign that says Augusta 20 miles and get out and say, see, it says Augusta, we're here. No, you're not. The sign is pointing forward, beyond itself, to the greater reality. And John says that the miracles of Jesus are not just demonstrations of power. They're certainly not just party tricks. They are signs, meaning they point to greater realities. And what John has done, and does many different places, and certainly does here in this text, is to layer in all kinds of rich biblical symbolism that is meant on further reflection to reveal more and more of what this act, turning water into wine, shows us about the glory of Jesus. There are layers here that that are meant to be seen over periods of reflection. Well, what is this sign pointing to? And the first thing I'd say is that Jesus is Lord of new creation joy. New creation joy. Now, there's all kinds of symbols of creation here. The story starts, John starts just like Genesis starts. The first book of the Bible starts by saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and then walking us through 7 days, a week of creation. John's gospel starts with the same first few words in Greek instead of Hebrew, but in the beginning. That's how he introduces Jesus. It's a new creation that John is introducing in the person of Jesus. And in fact, he tells us about a week. Now, John says here in chapter 2 that this happened on the third day. But actually, that's at the end of a string of signals that John has given us, telling us what day it is. It actually starts all the way back in verse 19. That's the first day of the week, when John the Baptist says, Jesus is the Messiah. I'm not the Messiah, but the Messiah is coming. And then in verse 29, after that day, it says the next day. And then in verse 35, it says the next day. And then in verse 43, it says the next day. In other words, he's showing us day by day. Now this day, then the next day, then the next day. And then 3 days after that, there's the miracle of the wedding at Cana. Put that all together. Scholars have all seen this, different kinds of scholars from different perspectives. What you have is 7 days. So in other words, John starts with Greek saying, in the beginning, and then he shows us 7 days, a week in the life of Jesus. And what he is signaling is that this creation story from Genesis is now a story in the life of Jesus of new creation. New creation. Well, that's symbolism, okay? That's the sign. It's just pointing to something, that Jesus does this on the third day. But there's more than that. Of course, the act itself is an act of creation. Jesus takes water, it's just plain old water, it's just normal water, and he turns it into wine. That's an act of creation, of course, miraculous creation. Jesus has the power of creation. But not just 7 days and not just the act itself as an act of creation, but what he does is symbolic throughout the Old Testament prophets of when the Messiah would come, that he would usher in a new era of new creation. And when he did that, the prophets say it would be a day of abundant wine. Now, Jesus here turns 6 containers that each contain 20 to 30 gallons of water into wine. That's a lot of wine. It's 120, 180 gallons of wine. It's a lot. Fine wine. It's abundant provision. And it is reminiscent of what the prophets said about when the Messiah would come. Amos says in Amos 9, the days are coming when the planter will be overtaken by the one treading grapes. He writes, new wine will drip from the mountains, will flow from the hills, and I will bring my people Israel back from exile. Just overflowing wine, which was a symbol throughout the Old Testament of abundance and joy. Or here is a great one. Isaiah chapter 25. Isaiah prophesies the day when there will be a tremendous, dramatic act of new creation when the Messiah comes. He writes, on this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats and the finest of wines. On this mountain he will destroy the shroud that enfolds all peoples, the sheet that covers all nations. He will swallow up death forever. The sovereign Lord will wipe away the tears from all faces. He will remove his people's disgrace from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken. These are symbols of the Messiah coming with life-giving power, with an abundance of joy, and with an overturning of the power of death itself. This is a description of a new world with incredible abundance, with all tears wiped away, with all disgrace removed. This is nothing less than a new creation. And here's Jesus on the seventh day of the week doing this act of abundant creation that echoes the words of the prophets. It's a sign. Jesus is the Lord of new creation joy. But that's not all. He's not only the Lord of new creation joy, he's also the Lord of new covenant love. This all takes place at a wedding, which is significant. Just a couple of chapters later, John the Baptist will describe Jesus as the bridegroom. And maybe if you've read the New Testament, you know that this is an image that shows up again and again in the ministry of Jesus, that Jesus is pictured as a groom who will come to gather his people as his bride. That's a picture of a covenant relationship, which is a relationship of privileges and promises by which two parties give themselves to one another. Jesus himself is described this way, but of course the Old Testament God is described as the husband to his people Israel. He makes a covenant with them, and this is one of the images of that God marries Israel. He says to them this pledge, I will be your God, and you will be my people. It's a covenant relationship of deep covenant commitment. But what we know is that Israel, God's people, did not keep their end of the bargain. They broke the covenant. In fact, they weren't able to keep it. This is what John writes just a little bit earlier in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17. Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. John is saying there that the old covenant, the old relationship where God said, I will be your God and you will be my people. It will be like I'm committing to you in a marriage type covenant. Well, I give myself to you, but I also call you to belong to me. That kind of a covenant, that kind of relationship, the old covenant was a grace. It was a good gift of God where he invited people to be his own. It was a covenant that came through Moses, even more particularly at Mount Sinai, as Moses came down with the Ten Commandments and with the law, and there was a kind of marriage ceremony there where God said, I will be your God, but where the people said, we will be your people, which means we will live by your law. That was a grace, that was a gift. But it wasn't enough. Not for people like us. Israel broke the covenant. They weren't able to keep it. In other words, all of this takes place at a marriage ceremony. But in the background is the reality that Israel's marriage to God is broken because they have sinned. But here comes Jesus, the bridegroom. who has come to reclaim God's people for God, who has come to bring not only a new creation, but also to bring it through his new covenant love. Jesus comes pledging himself to us, to take us as his own, to save us, and to make us new. And so the first miracle he does is done at a wedding where Jesus provides everything that is needed for a wedding celebration. In fact, he gives a signal that this is what he's thinking about in his words to his mother. He says to her in verse 4, "Woman, why do you involve me?" We'll come back to that in a moment. "My hour has not yet come." In John, whenever Jesus talks about his hour, he's always talking about his death on the cross. It's as if Jesus is saying to her, look, you think of this wedding feast. You want me to get involved in this wedding feast, but this wedding feast is just a smaller part of a bigger work that I'm doing. My hour will come, Jesus says, in which I will die on the cross, and like wine, my blood will flow. And I will provide for a wedding feast that will blow this feast out of the water. You want me to get involved here? I have come for this greater purpose. The hour is coming when I will provide abundantly everything that is needed for sinners, for those who have failed God and failed others, who have run out of living in their own power, who have run out of their own strength and their own supply, who've lost their joy, who've hit their end. The hour is coming, Mother, when I will provide everything they need so they can feast forever, so that they can be loved eternally. And in that hour, I will pay for all of it. I, as the bridegroom, will pay for the whole tab when I die publicly and when my blood flows like wine. This is astonishing hope, and the New Testament is brimming with this hope in Christ. That what he was doing was what he was about was something so much bigger than a few miracles. He was about nothing less than making everything new and doing it through his own death on your behalf. This means for those at the end of your resources, at the end exhausted in your own marriage, tired of your own fears, struggling with your own sins, dealing with your own lack of faith and hope, that there is one who out of his own provision and out of his own endless supply and out of his own sacrifice in your place can give you more than enough of what you need, who can save you and cleanse you and make you his own. Jesus is the Lord of new creation joy and new covenant love. So what does this mean for us? This is all a lot of symbolism. What does this mean for us? To see that, let's just look at Mary to end. Mary is Jesus' mother. She's related to him by the usual close and precious connection of being his mother. She carried him in her womb. She cared for him in his infancy and childhood. She loved him. She even grew to depend on him. She comes to him first when there's a problem at this wedding. And yet here Jesus speaks to her in a way that puts some distance between them, doesn't he? She comes to him and says they have no more wine. And he says, "Woman, why do you involve me?" Now, this word, woman, is not it's not cold like it sounds in English. In Greek, it's actually just a formal way of addressing someone, like ma'am. But it's still pushing back. It's still creating some space here. Jesus, you may know, speaks to his Father. When he prays to his heavenly Father, he prays Abba, Father, which is Aramaic, familiar, intimate term by which Jesus relates to his heavenly Father. It's more like dad than sir. Dad. But when he turns to Mary, he says, ma'am. He's creating distance. Why? Because Jesus is letting her know that he is the Lord of new creation and new covenant. He's not an ordinary child, but he is Lord, and she has no inside track on him, and she is not in charge over him. He's Lord of creation and new creation, and he will bring it about in his authority and on his own timetable. It's a gentle rebuke, as one commentator says, but it's still a bit of a rebuke. And yet Mary still comes to Jesus. Now she receives his rebuke, and she comes to him and now says to the servants this new phrase. Not, Jesus, you have no wine, like she's trying to tell him what to do. Instead, she comes to him in this way. She says to the servants, do whatever he tells you to. Do whatever he tells you to. This is how you respond to a Lord who is the Lord of new creation and new covenant. Humble, trusting submission. He will do what he wills in his time. Our job is to trust him and to obey. J.C. Ryle writes about this. Duties are ours. Events are God's. It's ours to fill the water pots. It's Christ's to make the water wine. If we are going to know this Jesus, not just as one of miracle working power at one point, but as one who actually can provide the joy of a new creation, who has promised to wipe away every tear, who has committed himself to us to never let us escape outside of the grip of his loving care. If Jesus is this Lord of new creation and new covenant, then our role is not to tell him what to do, but to do our duty and to trust in him. This is the life of humble faith that looks in Jesus and says, I don't have all the answers myself. I haven't made all the best decisions myself. I don't take myself all that seriously, but I do believe that Jesus Christ is Lord, that he lived, that he died, that on the third day he rose, which means that this world is a place in which resurrection has happened, and Jesus Christ is the Lord of resurrection. And he is making all things new. And his love for me will never end. Which means that far more of this broken and bruised world can be mended and can be healed than you can imagine. Which means we trust him and do whatever he tells us to. Which also means that Christian experience is meant to be an experience of the love and the joy that comes from knowing a living Christ. So may you trust him. And as you believe in him, may you know the abundant joy that only he can give. Would you receive this benediction and blessing as you go through this week? Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. Amen.